Hello, everyone. My name is Aslı Peker. I am the Associate Director for the IR program here at NYU. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second event of the semester of the Conflict, Security and Development series. The series is co-sponsored by the Center for Global Affairs at NYU School for Professional Studies, the Program in International Relations at NYU's Graduate School of Arts and Science, Robert L. Bernstein Institute for Human Rights at NYU Law, the International Education Program at NYU Steinhardt, and the Office of International Programs at NYU Wagner. And our speaker today is Dr. Jessica Eise. She is an assistant professor of social and environmental challenges at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And Dr. Eise's research currently focuses on understanding agricultural and rural communities and the complex social systems that influence the ability to adapt to changing climates. She also researches the human connection with the environment, how technology can be used to support pro-social environmental change, and how we can communicate science better and more effectively. She is the founder of the blended academic social project Clima e Café, an innovative targeted climate change initiative to support climate change adaptation in the Colombian coffee sector. Dr. Eise's books include How to Feed the World and the Communication Scarcity in Agriculture, and her research has been cited or appeared in such outlets as Vice, Vox, Scientific American, Salon, and CNBC, amongst others. She won a National Essay Award for her piece on artificial intelligence, The Fatal Flaw. Dr. Eise has a PhD in communication from Purdue University and a master's degree in journalism and international relations from New York University. So she's an alumni of the IR program, and we are so happy to have her back. Her talk today is titled Climate Change and Future of Conflict. After Dr. Eise's talk, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please hold on to your questions. You can also write them on the chat, I think. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So today I'm going to talk about climate change and the future of conflict. So for many years, even decades, messaging around climate change has focused primarily on endangered animals and nature, seeking in many ways to elicit human reactions and responses in the face of the dangers posed to species and unique natural phenomenon around the world. So beloved animals such as the polar bears are being threatened. You know, our gorgeous landscapes are at risk. We're losing species that will never be recovered. Our beautiful coral reefs are being destroyed. Our glaciers are melting, never to return in our lifespans. These messages, they're all true, and they're all concerning and upsetting. I was born in Anchorage, Alaska, and my parents have video footage of me as a toddler at Portage Glacier with glaciers in the background behind me. And when I went back 20 years later, all those glaciers were gone. However, the reality is that Earth, which is a magnificent system that still exists well beyond our complete understanding, will ultimately recover from the harm that we're doing through our release of carbon. It will look different. It will boast different species and plants, but it will adapt. Earth is a far more powerful force than we are. The question, though, is whether we, the human species, will be here when it does, or whether we will exacerbate Earth's change to a point that we drive ourselves to extinction through conflict and resource scarcity. And this is exactly what we're here to talk about today: climate change and the future of conflict. I think that it's time to reorient our way of discussing climate change and approaching it as not just a threat to animals and nature, but as an active factor influencing human conflict, security, and development. Any discussions involving conflict and security should now always have climate change on the table as a major force influencing outcomes. In this talk, I'm going to give a macro perspective of why this should be the case and the three major impacts of climate change that can significantly exacerbate and increase conflict around the world if they are not preemptively addressed. These are food insecurity, water shortages, and population growth and ensuing migration. They are all interrelated, which I will note as we move through the talk, and each one has the potential to significantly increase conflict or to be mitigated in advance. The first of these I'm going to discuss is food insecurity, or hunger, and how this will increase under climate change if not aggressively addressed, and how this increase will influence conflict. The best way to prevent future hunger crises is to take action before they develop. Hunger is a very dangerous state, leading to desperation and crisis. Eisenhower, who commanded US forces in Europe during World War II, understood where such conditions could lead. I will slightly amend a quote of his to include both men and women, given our subsequent advances in gender equality since his time. But the thrust of what he says in this 1958 speech is both accurate and timeless. I quote, "In vast stretches of the earth, men and women awoke today in hunger. They will spend the day in unceasing toil. And as the sun goes down, they will still know hunger. They will see suffering in the eyes of their children. Many despair that their labor will ever decently shelter their families or protect them against disease. So long as this is so, peace and freedom will be in danger throughout our world. For wherever free men and women lose hope of progress, liberty will be weakened and the seeds of conflict will be sown." In 2020, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the United Nations World Food Program for its efforts to combat hunger. That choice starkly underscored growing concern about increasing global food insecurity and the clear connections between hunger and conflict. The relationship between conflict and hunger is an unfortunate one, as they both perpetuate the other. Conflict causes rampant food insecurity. It disrupts infrastructure and social stability, making it hard for supplies to get to people who need them. Too often, warring parties may deliberately use starvation as a strategy. However, food insecurity also perpetuates conflict, as it drives people from their homes, lands, and jobs, and deepens existing fault lines and grievances. As the Nobel Peace Prize Award makes clear, a world of peace and stability hinges upon everyone receiving the most basic of human dignities, which is the food they need to live. So why are climate change and hunger so inextricably linked? And what are the more nuanced, detailed impacts of hunger? Well, Earth's climate has swung into and out of ice ages since the dawn of time. In the last 50 years, however, things have changed. Average global temperatures have increased ever more quickly, with new recorded highs occurring again and again over the past decade. The rapid changes over the past 50 years are due to the main driver of climate change, which is human activity, primarily the release of greenhouse gases due to burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. An example of these emissions that are causing climate change are carbon dioxide and methane. Our energy, industry, transport, building, and agricultural sectors are among the main emitters. And while many people think climate change mainly means warmer temperatures, this is only a part of the impact of climate change. Because the Earth is a system where everything is connected, changes in one area can influence changes in all others, and the consequences of climate change now include intense droughts, water scarcity, severe fires, rising sea levels, flooding, melting polar ice, catastrophic storms, declining biodiversity. As a result, some regions of the world are getting wetter, including the northern United States and Canada, while others are becoming drier, such as the southwestern United States. For instance, in the US Midwest, heavy rainfall events increased by over a third from 1958 to 2012. These changes in weather patterns, which differ based on each region and its unique characteristics, may not directly impact many industries. For instance, Many people live and work inside. Heavy rains are an inconvenience, droughts are an inconvenience, but they don't have a severe impact on our livelihood or way of life. But there is one sector in particular that is among the most exposed and vulnerable to climate change, and that is agriculture. Crops and livestock are extremely sensitive to temperature and precipitation. A late spring frost can be devastating, and a heat wave during the flowering stage of certain crops can result in a sharply reduced yield. In short, agriculture is what my colleague calls the Goldilocks industry. The weather should not be too hot or too cold, and the rainfall must be just right. Farmers often learn their farming techniques from generational knowledge that's passed down through their ancestors based on traditional indicators. For instance, they may have learned to plant a particular crop the second week of April every year and to harvest in late September. They may rely on these practices to inform their choices. But with a shifting climate, these traditional cues for how to farm may rapidly become or already are obsolete. And the crops they are accustomed to growing may no longer be appropriate for the environment. Going forward, some places will have too little water to farm, while others may have enough, but find it falls at the wrong time, or it arrives less frequently, but in larger rainfall events. All of this has serious implications for crop yields, or the amount of food a farmer is able to harvest with each crop. And this, in turn, has implications for everyone, because we rely upon agriculture for our food supply. While most of us in the United States no longer see agriculture due to migration to urban areas and the mechanization of farming, such that far fewer people are required to work in agriculture, it is the source of all our sustenance. And as climate change impacts increase, crops will be increasingly impacted, with higher incidences of crop failure, pests that damage crops, and farmers needing to switch to new crops as the ones that used to thrive in the environment no longer do. Without intervention, mitigation and adaptation to climate change impacts, our ability to grow crops will be increasingly impacted. And as such, we will begin to see food shortages. And with food shortages, hunger, an area in which we are already not doing well, which already impacts nearly 10% of the population, is going to increase. And when it comes to the issue of hunger, hunger has nuanced impacts. While we often look at hunger as a simple equation of someone not getting enough calories, it's actually far more complex. And each component of this complexity has an implication for conflict and potential conflict. So let's look at some of the basics of hunger. All right, so we as humans, we need a wide range of nutrients to thrive. And we usually get these from eating a varied diet. So eating a monotonous diet means that we're eating generally the same thing. And as such, we fail to get protein and micronutrients, which are necessary for our health and growth. For instance, the micronutrients iron, zinc, and iodine are essential for brain development. And many low-income diets depend heavily on coarse grains and starchy roots, which are deficient in all three. These micronutrients are so important that some researchers have suggested that ridding the planet of these three deficiencies could actually raise the world's IQ by 10 points. Under climate change, if certain crops fail and only others are available, it isn't enough that there are some. There needs to be a variety. And much of this may need to depend upon international trade, which I will cover later in my talk. In the developed world, many people are able to take a diverse diet for granted. Yet where crops are able to be grown and what are able to be grown will be shifting, and this will have implications for the variety of food that is affordable and at our disposal. Additionally, hunger impacts the future of our society more than anyone, which is our children. When children experience prolonged hunger, they can suffer from what we call stunting. Stunting is a very harmful health outcome for children, and it is largely irreversible. It's a result of the buildup over time of ongoing undernutrition and poor health. Nutritionists identify children as stunted if their height falls below that of 95% of well-nourished children of the same age. These are kids that are labeled at high risk. And the reason why this is so serious is because much of the brain's capacity and structure are already determined by the age of 3. And the brain's development is correlated with a child's outward physical growth. This is a primary reason why stunting is used to measure malnutrition. Brain systems regulating mood begin developing even before birth. Those in charge of attention and multitasking have a growth spurt in the first 6 months after birth. The regions governing spatial understanding grow most rapidly in the first 18 months after birth. During these and other critical periods, nutritional deficiencies can seriously undermine development, leaving small children permanently behind the curve and disadvantaged. They have lost opportunities even before they had a chance to reach for them. While young brains are developmentally flexible, and mental stimulation and interaction with caregivers can sometimes compensate for lack of nutrition in a growing child, catch-up is extremely difficult, and the possibility of recovering from nutritional deficits diminishes over time. So while adults can go hungry for some time with little long-term damage, young children cannot, and the effects can be permanent. So if confronted with massive food shortages, the damage done to the youngest of our society will carry reverberations down the line. Wherever there is childhood malnutrition, it also tends to perpetuate itself across generations. Studies have shown that growth rates before 12 months of age can accurately predict cognitive performance at age 9. More research suggests that early nutritional deficits may be correlated with reduced cognitive capacity in later adulthood. This has devastating implications because poorly nourished children grow up to be less successful than they otherwise could, which increases the likelihood of passing on undernourishment to their own children. There's a legacy here that is passed on, and during a crisis such as climate change, we need populations that are able to reach their max capacity for problem solving and resiliency. What is more, I dare say that there cannot be a desperation quite so intense as a parent or caregiver's desire to feed their children. And very little a person in that situation would not do. Good people may commit atrocious acts to prevent the starvation and death of their children. And the generational trauma this creates will reverberate for a very long time. We should not place people in the situation where they have no choice between food security for their family or conflict, because we failed to take preventable action on climate change. Now I'd like to move to the subject of water, which is inextricably linked with agriculture due to the need to water crops and livestock. Under climate change, we will see rising temperatures and more droughts and floods. The lack of water under drought is obvious, but what is not so clear is that there is also a lack of drinking water during floods. During a flood, there is water everywhere, but it isn't potable, meaning flooded areas can actually have a dire shortage of drinking water because all the water sources have become contaminated and are not safe for human consumption. Put simply, we need water to live, we need it to grow our food, and we need it to produce the electricity and fuel that transport food to our doors. If there are extreme droughts or floods, or not enough water, we cannot grow the crops we need to feed people, and people cannot get enough water to drink. Despite its critical importance to all life and feeding us, many of us take water for granted. All of the water we use comes from somewhere, and this supply of water is called a water resource. There are 2 major categories of water resources, which are surface resources, those that appear on the surface of the earth, such as rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. And there are groundwater resources, which include underground aquifers that are saturated with water and can be pumped to the surface. Rain that falls from the sky and lands directly on the soil and feeds into the root of a plant is the most direct and sustainable way of delivering water. In agriculture, this is referred to as rain-fed, and it uses a green water resource, which is the most efficient and ecological type of water resource. However, the biggest challenge in maintaining rain-fed agriculture is variability in rainfall, a challenge that will grow in many places as climate change impacts intensify. There are a couple ways people strive to manage green water resources better. One way is to improve the health of soil so it retains water better, and another is rainwater harvesting or storing rainwater for times when it's no longer needed. Aquifers are a treasure trove of fresh, clean water. An aquifer is an underground body of rock or sediment that holds water. People access an aquifer by digging a well, and when too much water is pumped out of an aquifer, we will harm it beyond repair and permanently erase what was once an incredible and necessary source of water. This is because aquifers need time to refill with water as it rains. And if too much is pumped out, it creates a cone of depression. Basically, the earth collapses in on itself. In this case, the aquifer can never come back. When more water is removed from an aquifer than is replaced, we call it mining an aquifer. Over-mining or large-scale aquifer pumping is unsustainable and a major threat, and it is happening in many places in the United States and the world. If water is taken out judiciously, aquifers will replenish. But if too much is taken out too fast, then they're gone forever. We are over-mining our aquifers for reasons that don't make sense, such as decorative lawns or watering livestock in areas that don't have enough natural water resources and should probably not be used for livestock growth. What is more, every food product we eat contains some volume of invisible water that was used during its growth, but that is no longer contained in the actual food product itself. During crop growth, a huge quantity of water is consumed that doesn't actually stay in the plant. Much of the water is returned to the atmosphere as water vapor while the crop is being grown. Water footprints are considered the volume of water needed to produce a final food product, as no one sees the amount of water that went into creating the food on their plate. The water footprint differs between food products and also between how and where the crop or animal was grown or raised. Water shortages, like food shortages, are drivers of conflict and are intertwined. And they also feed into the last major point related to climate change that I'm going to discuss today before we look more into solutions, which is how population and hunger are intertwined, and ergo, conflict and population are intertwined. So let's talk about population for a moment and how this feeds into mass migration movements. The number of people, where these people live, and how old these people are all impact food security. While we produce enough food today to feed our nearly 8 billion people, we still have not managed to do so. And now, facing increasing impacts of climate change that impact our ability to farm and grow crops, our population continues to grow. Without taking action on climate change, we will reach a point where we also do not produce enough food. Population is significantly more complicated than a number just rising or decreasing. It underpins many concerns around hunger and food insecurity. Basically, population can be broken down into mortality rates, or the age at which a person dies, and fertility rates, or how many children a woman has. If people in a population die young, say on average in their 50s, which is the case in Mozambique, they have high mortality. If people die at an old age, like in Japan, which is on average in their 80s, they have a low mortality. Now to fertility. It's considered high when a woman has, say, on average 5 babies, also the case in Mozambique. Fertility is low when a woman has on average 1.4 babies, which is the case in Japan. So using Japan as the example, Japan has low mortality, low fertility. And using Mozambique as a counterexample, they have high mortality, high fertility. In general, wealthier countries have transitioned to a low mortality, low fertility model, while poorer countries tend to retain a high mortality, high fertility model. This matters because where people live is a very important component of population and hunger. Right. Today, Asia currently hosts a majority of the world's population at almost 60%, with China and India as the most populous countries. However, as the legacy of China's one policy grows, their population will decline, and India will significantly overtake them. Today, while the African continent has fewer inhabitants than China, it is there that the largest population increases are expected. In most places, the population is generally young and prevailing fertility rates are high. So we can anticipate the largest population growth in the next century in the African continent. Conversely, Europe's population is shrinking. Fertility rates are very low in many places. Today, they make up 10% of the population, and it's anticipated that this will shrink in the years ahead to a projected 6% of the world's population. So inequality is reflected in population. It signals a kind of demographic divide between rich and poor countries. Populations in high-income countries are comparatively small and grow slowly, if at all. Poorer countries, on the other hand, tend to have high fertility and grow rapidly. Poor countries already experience food insecurity, poor housing and infrastructure, and limited education and healthcare. With their populations growing, they face a nearly impossible task of feeding this population. The imbalance of resources and the pressures that will be placed on some parts of the globe over others will create massive migrations, far greater than we see today. And we already observe how contentious migration issues are today and how, in general, poorly they are handled. Immigration can lead to ethnic and religious fractionalization, which may foment social strife and increase the likelihood of violent conflicts. And the increase in the number of migrants can contribute to conflict in migrant receiving areas in many ways, ranging from competition over natural and economic resources to ethnic tensions, to socioeconomic tensions, to burdens on infrastructure and services. However, trying to stem the tides of massive migrations is an exercise in futility. In the end, no physical barriers can stop people from moving. And while the flow of migration, both across and within countries, could be slowed, it cannot really be stopped. Regardless of the barriers, people who are desperate for a better way of life, or even just any life at all, will find any way possible to obtain that. And the reality is that we would too, if we were ever placed in a situation where life here became untenable and there were no resources, no food, no water, and rampant conflict. And so, unchecked, unaddressed climate change will exacerbate food scarcity, water scarcity, and migration. And all of these will exacerbate conflict. So now, what can we do about it? The obvious answer is that we as rapidly as we possibly can, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions while concurrently implementing an aggressive carbon capture strategy. However, I'm going to be a little more specific about how we can reduce certain pressures related to agriculture, water scarcity, and population migration if we do not obtain the necessary global movements to prevent the majority of climate change impacts to come. First, regarding the question of migration, this can be prevented or reduced by controlling population growth. And no, this does not need to be done through a dystopian method of population control. On the contrary, like most solutions to climate change, it involves creating a more equitable world. Quite simply, we need to educate and empower girls. Countries can and do transition to low mortality, low fertility rates. And it's not only because they become wealthy. Underlying that is the education and health care that increases for girls and women, which encourages family planning. Rising education for girls is correlated with lower fertility. The more educated girls are, the more empowered they are to make wise family planning decisions for themselves and their communities. So while on its face, the link may not be obvious, the chain is clear. The more we advocate for and educate girls around the world, the lower the fertility rates in those areas. And the lower the population growth, the less pressure there will be for mass migrations because there will be less shortages, because there is less pressure on existing resources. Not to mention, I dare say that women and girls have a lot to offer in the face of climate change. And cutting out half your population from contributing to this massive challenge by withholding education is an idiotic move from the get-go. Regarding food security and water security, there's going to be a particular global phenomenon that we're going to need to rely on heavily if we're going to avoid conflict, and that is international trade. As agriculture depends on climate and soil, some areas are well suited for farming and some areas aren't. The only way people in some regions can enjoy fresh fruits or vegetables during the winter or other food products that can't be grown locally is to import them from other places. Trade enriches our lives because it allows us to have a variety of food at affordable prices. International trade can be contentious, but moving beyond the contention to successfully negotiate international trade will be necessary to eradicate hunger, particularly as climate change impacts increase and start causing regional shortages due to drought or extreme weather events. As climate change drives permanent shifts in the geography of the world's agricultural production zones, international trade will emerge as an important resiliency mechanism for reducing hunger and for enhancing equal access to food. For instance, a 2012 heat wave and drought prompted major losses in corn harvests in the United States. Producers in the Southern Hemisphere adjusted to the shortfall, which served to moderate price increases in the United States. This was only possible because of international trade. Basically, when one country faces a major food shortage due to extreme weather events, they will need to be able to rely on international trade from other nations to bolster their supplies. Creating the most equitable possible policies on international trade will reduce conflict and create a network of support as opposed to one of competition. The key here is to recall that although one country may face abundance for several years, it may very well have shortages for the ensuing years. Goodwill built on fair trade will prevent the opposite side of what this situation could provoke, which is war to obtain resources. Regarding agriculture itself, we can invest in innovation and technology. For instance, precision agriculture can leverage computers, global positioning systems, geographic information systems, and sensors to provide the data necessary to give each tiny parcel of land in a field exactly the inputs it needs. When water is scarce, knowing exactly where it is needed and how much to use will prevent massive waste. And a resurgent interest is occurring in use of the time-honored technology of cover crops to mitigate climate change impacts. We can go even smaller in our measurements with the emergence of nanotechnology. Aside from making field sensors smaller and more compact, nanotechnologies can also help improve how fertilizers and pesticides are released. By putting chemical inputs into tiny capsules or in gels, it's possible to control when and how these inputs are released to make them more effective and at the same time significantly reduce chemical emissions and runoff. Climate change renders generational and historical information about farming less valuable. What worked before may no longer apply in an altered climate. When historical knowledge no longer works, farmers must rely on other sources of information, such as meteorologists, agronomists, and other scientists, as well as the development of new sustainable technologies. Farmers in the most advanced economies, including the United States, already rely heavily on scientific knowledge, which is often mediated by the private sector or by local extension services. However, farmers in the poorest countries, which in many cases will suffer the most severe impacts from climate change, rarely have access to such knowledge. Even in wealthy countries, these adjustments are costly, and public funding for agricultural research and development has been declining for a decade in the United States. And the poorest countries in the world account for just 3% of global spending on agricultural research, Without investments into sharing research discoveries, many advances in wealthier countries will not be transferred to low-income nations. Many people think that the answer to solving hunger is to go back to the way we grew food before technology came along. But that would be a huge mistake and would significantly increase hunger and starvation. Our productivity, the amount of food we can grow, is much higher today due to technology and research. Today, one farmer can produce so much more on a parcel of land than before. The key is to now make sure all farmers have access to technologies that can help them, as like hunger, there is inequity in farming, with wealthy farmers being able to afford expensive technologies and education, while poor farmers cannot. Also, we will need to rely on technology and research to help us make farming everywhere more sustainable and environmentally friendly. So not only does our farming become more efficient, it also decreases its exacerbation of climate change. This brings me to the end of my talk. As we have seen, unchecked climate change will increase hunger, water shortages, and mass migrations, all of which have the potential to increase conflict. So the question stands, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to watch the world burn, literally and metaphorically, as climate impacts worsen and conflict increases? Or are we going to rapidly innovate and build more equitable systems? Climate change isn't a me problem. It's not something one nation can solve. It's an us problem. And if we follow the old order the way we have done it, then a few of us may make it out the other side, but none of us can count on that being us. This is one of those moments where we need to remember that our political and economic systems are socially constructed. That means that we as humans have designed them. They are not laws of the universe. And just as we have designed them, we can toss them out and radically re-envision new ways of doing things and approaching international relations, trade, innovation, and technology. This isn't naive dreaming. This is reality. Our current system will not unite us in a way that takes us where we need to go. But we can each contribute to modifying and building off of the one we have to get to one that will. One of the questions I get most often from people is, what can I do to help? There's a lot of goodwill, a lot of people who care, and a lot of people who want to do the right thing. The answer to the question, what can I do to help, is actually very difficult, because the reality is that what we need is for everyone, for you, to use your abilities to innovate, to take the knowledge you have of whatever industry it is you work in and dream up ways it could be better than what you ever imagined, and then have the courage and determination to try to help it move a few degrees in that direction. Solving climate change is going to require that we all reach into the deep well of our imagination and innovation to create a solution based on our unique talents and to systematically implement it every day. Basically, climate change doesn't need a hero. It needs millions of heroes. As I end this talk, I'd like to conclude on one point. And that is what climate change doesn't need. And these two things are outrage and despair. Our society is collectively simmering in a vast pool of indignation and outrage, and that is a tremendous waste of energy. It burns up everything we have, and there's nothing left for productive action. Basically, it takes a lot of energy to hate, and that energy is best spent elsewhere. And regarding despair and nihilism, despair paralyzes us. We freeze in the face of hopelessness, and nihilism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what I would encourage all of you to do to help adapt as I wrap up today is to try to acquire an attitude of action, commitment, and realistic optimism. Anger is healthy and normal, but only insofar as it is the impetus to push us towards creation and solution building. Anger is not the And so on that note, I'd like to thank you all for joining me, and I welcome any questions or discussion.